Welcome back, guys. So in this lesson, we're going to see another game of how a London player can tackle the King's Indian setup. Now, this is a game that I played about a year ago. I was playing against a player by the name of Vincent Doe, who's a pretty young player from Illinois. I believe he's rated over 2200. But in this game, he didn't put up much of a fight. I was able to get kind of the ideal setup out of the opening and then finish off with a nice attack. So going forward here, we're going to see a very similar variation to the game with Grishuk, with this early knight to c3, preparing e4. And my opponent actually started thinking here, which is usually a good sign. If the opponent starts thinking after knight to c3, then they're debating whether or not to allow e4, probably debating between bishop g7, d6, and d5. Here my opponent played d5, and I continued in the style of Grishuk, e3, bishop g7, and now h4. And of course, I have all these looming ideas of playing h5. I was more than ready if my opponent were to castle here, I would go for h5 and would be very happy to go into this exchange sacrifice line. So again, my opponent started thinking after I play h4, and he responded with probably the safest move, pawn h5, stopping any possibility of myself playing h5. The drawback of black playing h5 in such a position is it's somewhat of a long-term weakness, as the pawn can't obviously move backwards, and as black is still planning to castle kingside, there's some weaknesses on the king side, mainly with g5 square. There's also the potential for later in the game, as we'll see, where white can perhaps create some breakthrough with f3 and g4. So going forward here, I first developed knight to f3, castle, and now knight e5, wasting no time to improve my knights. The main idea of knight e5 is to essentially discourage this bishop from developing to g4. As I have played h4 myself, g4 is slightly more of a weak square, but in this case, after knight e5, g4 can't really be exploited. I also have ideas of possibly playing f3 in the near future. So here my opponent played somewhat of a slow move, and it was a sign that he probably wasn't familiar with the right plan for black in this sort of structure. My opponent played pawn to c6. Now what he should have done is play pawn to c5, much more active and ambitious move. Now it is possible maybe he was scared of something like d takes c5 and didn't want to gambit a pawn, but then black can probably just get away with queen a5 to exert some pressure, very easily win the pawn back, also combine that with knight e4. So if he were to play c5, I probably would have continued with a very solid queen d2, perhaps considering castling queenside. And then the game can continue. If he were to take, I could take. And I should note that white is staying flexible here. I can still decide whether I want to castle kingside or queenside. A move like knight c6 can be met with yet another flexible move, f3. And I can basically steer the game in the way I want it to. If I want to make it a lot sharper, I could castle queenside and go for g4 ideas. If I wanted to have a more quiet game, I could play something like bishop e2, castling kingside, rook d1, and just focus on center play. But that didn't happen. My opponent played c6. And I was happy to complete development, bishop d3, bishop e6. Somewhat of an awkward move for the bishop. Not sure why he would want to put the bishop on e6. Maybe he wanted to play knight d7 and have the bishop on a more active square. But the bishop just seemed very awkward on e6. So I continue. I play queen f3, realizing that my queen could be very nicely placed on g3. As we'll see, knight bd7, queen g3, not only forming some battery against the queen side along this h2 b8 diagonal, but also having some potential attacking ideas against the king side. Perhaps black is already maybe a bit worried about possible sacrifices on g6. Now, I never did sacrifice on g6, but it's always nice to make your opponent think and put the pressure on them. So here my opponent plays rook to c8, which in my opinion, it's a slow move, and definitely not the best move. The idea is he wants to prepare c5, but what he should have done is play c5 right away. And again, it's it's a matter of playing kind of a bit more actively for black in this position. And c5 would have been a bit annoying, as I did have a plan to play knight e2 and c3, just to get the optimum setup for my pieces. If I were to play knight e2 in this position, that would be a pretty tragic mistake, as c4 would trap the bishop. So after he played rook to c8, preparing c5, I have just enough time to get my ideal setup after knight e2, c5, and now c3, and my bishop is no longer getting trapped. And if we look at white's setup, actually the pieces have very nice harmony. I really couldn't complain here. My king is still in the center, but that was completely okay because the center is relatively closed for the time being. And I still have the option whether or not I want castle, and whether I want to castle kingside or queenside. So I was pretty content here. My opponent played c4. I drop back to c2. Then he hops into e4 with the knight. Now knight e4, it looks like a kind of strong, somewhat annoying move, but we should note that this is not an outpost square for the knight, as I always have these ideas of f3. So I very simply move my queen back to h2. And now queen h2 is actually an important move for later on, because not only do I keep it along this diagonal, but perhaps more importantly, I create another battery along h-file. And even though the h-file is closed in this position, we're going to see in just a few moves how I do attempt to open up this line to attack. So going forward here, my opponent played queen b6, trying to create some initiative on the queen side, but it was pretty lasted because after rook to b1, there's really no clear target black could attack. He played queen a5, going after the a2 pawn. I counterattack with f3, forcing the knight back to f6. And now a very simple, somewhat quiet move, just a3, making sure there's absolutely no play that black can get in this position. And I think this is an important part of sometimes building up an attack. Sometimes you want to be patient, and very often you want to look for ways to restrict your opponent and just kill their counterplay, so you can more easily focus on your own play later on in the game. And that's exactly what happened in this game. Black really had no active play. As we see, it's very hard to break through on the queen side. There's really no weaknesses that black can attack in this position. Everything is nicely defended. And meanwhile, I mean, what to do next for black? It's not so easy to find a move in this position. What my opponent did was capture on e5. Perhaps has some sense to it, but this only helps me improve the position further. After bishop take e5, the bishop now exerts a lot of nice pressure along this diagonal, and after knight to e8, this brings us to a very critical moment where black is simply wanting to trade to try and simplify matters in position, and it's up to me to create pressure, not let the position simplify too much. So I would encourage you to pause the video here and try and find the best continuation, the best attacking continuation for whites in this position. So hopefully you've been able to find this nice kind of breakthrough move, pawn g4, where the goal for white is to simply open up more lines on the king side. If I can open up the g file or the h file, then very good things will happen as both my queen and rook are ready for the position to open up. And here black is under major pressure, as there's no way to keep the king side closed, as the pawn tension will soon be, the pawns will soon be traded one way or the other. And the very simple threat for white is to take on h5. If g take h5, I can then happily shift over to the g file. And with the bishops staring down towards the king side, black's going to be under way too much pressure. So my opponent played this move, h take g4, perhaps a decent try, but now this allows another breakthrough move. And no, I don't recapture the pawn, but I go for the immediate pawn h5. And now, as we see, the h file is almost opening up. I'm also trying to open up this line for the bishop from c2. So my opponent, of course, doesn't want the h file to open up. He played the probably the most logical move in the position, pawn g5. But now it's a matter of finding the forcing line to essentially grab the initiative and not let go. So I would encourage you to find the move here for whites and try and calculate the forcing moves and see if you can come up with a concrete line for white to break through and win this position. Okay, so the move is first a very simple capture, bishop takes g7, and now black has a couple ways to recapture, both of which do not end well for black. Let's imagine knight takes g7 first, which wasn't played in the game. I'd be very happy to advance the pawn to h6, another forcing move, attacking the knight. And now if the knight were to move back to e8, we can see that, that white has a nice continuation, queen to e5, with the mate in one threat. And for some reason, a lot of players will miss this idea that a mate in one threat is a forcing move. In this case, I'm threatening h7, and black has to respond. Turns out there's not too many ways to respond here. I'm also threatening this move, queen takes g5. Black would probably have to move the f-pawn, but when the f-pawn moves perhaps to f6, I can very simply take on e6, just completely winning the position. So that's why knight takes g7 goes down pretty hard there. Meanwhile, what was played in the game, king takes g7, doesn't really do black much better. I still come in with queen to e5 check, and notice the f-pawn can't be moved. It's tied down to defending the bishop. I'm attacking the g-pawn, so a retreating move like king g8 or king h8 just runs into queen takes g5. So he played the only other move which tries to keep everything together, this move king h6. And again, I would encourage you to pause the video and find the move for white in this position. Turns out there is only one way to win from here. Every other move gives black some chances to equalize. Okay, so the move is very nice pawn break, pawn f4. Again, creating a mate threat with queen takes g5. And turns out the threat is just overwhelming for black. There's really no good way to respond to this. And for some reason during the game, what I struggled with is finding what to do after rook g8. I actually spent a long time on finding f4 because I was trying to figure out what would happen after rook g8. Turns out that white just has a simple mate in 2 here, with the final move being perhaps easily overlooked. First move being f takes g5, rook takes g5, and then queen h8. And for some reason, queen h8 took a while to come to mind, as I had some hallucination that the h8 square was guarded, where here it's clearly not. So pretty nice way to finish things off, at least in that line. What happened in the game, my opponent didn't play rook g8, he took on f4, and now it's just a matter of playing forcing moves, queen take f4, and then chasing the king back after king h8. My opponent did play it out until mates after queen h6, king g8, queen h7 checkmates. So it was a pretty feel-good game. What started as sort of one of these typical kind of anti-King's Indian lines. I think we call this opening the Barry attack, but very typical for a London player who likes to be aggressive. And I think a big takeaway from this game is knowing this sort of ideal setup. If we go to the position around the position c3, we can see that if you're playing this line, if you can get your pieces like this, it's one of the best ways to go forward in the game, and it opened up a lot of attacking possibilities later on. So this is a big takeaway that I want viewers to get from this lesson, is sometimes before you create an attack, you want to optimize your pieces, so then you have the best attacking potential and the best potential to find tactics later on in the game. So hope you guys enjoyed that, and I will see you in the next lesson.